Hello, everyone. I'm Della Watkins, the Executive Director here at the Columbia Museum of Art. I want to welcome you here today, and I hope to see you often and come back all through your holidays to enjoy the museum programming. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Lisa Small is the Senior Curator of European Art at Brooklyn Museum. Lisa was appointed Senior Curator of European Art in 2017 after joining the Brooklyn Museum in 2011 as the Curator of Exhibitions. At the museum, she has curated lots of exhibitions of all types, everything from Killer Heels, the art of high-heeled shoe, to Georgia O'Keeffe, Living Modern, to our currently touring exhibition, French Moderns, Monet to Matisse, 1850 to 1950. Lisa has overseen numerous installations of the museum's European collection, including most recently Monet to Marceau, the Real and Imagined European Art in 2022-23. In previous curatorial positions at the American Federation for the Arts and the Dahish Museum, she organized many exhibitions as well, including, and you might recognize, Turner to Cézanne, masterpieces from the Davies collection, everything to Napoleon on the Nile, soldiers, artists, and the rediscovery of Egypt. She's a native New Yorker, I have found. She's been very helpful in facilitating our work here at the museum, getting this show here and installed. And she's a real pleasure to get to know. I want you to know that I walked through the exhibition with her earlier today, and I'm happy to say, and it always makes me nervous, that she absolutely likes so much the color choices in the exhibition. She likes the design sensibility that is presented, and she also very much likes our curator, Michael Neumeister's senior curatorial arrangement. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Small.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Della, for such a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here, to be back in Columbia, in fact, because I was here when you all had the Turner to Cézanne exhibition. So I'm thrilled to be back and thrilled to see this exhibition here. It's like visiting old friends when I come to museums that have this installed. Okay, so getting started here. And I need my glasses. Okay. This photo, taken at the 1900 Paris World's Fair, features the Eiffel Tower next to a planetarium in the shape of a celestial globe. The pairing of these two symbols evokes Paris's global importance at that time, particularly its role as the world's most influential fine arts capital. From the 17th through the early 20th century, aspiring artists from all over Europe and the Americas came to Paris to study, to work, and to try and make a name for themselves. Certainly by the late 19th century, it was the place where avant-garde artists, dealers, and collectors together forged the new and modern art world that we know today. So in my talk, I want to highlight some of the works from the French Moderns exhibition that epitomize the art movements that shocked and defined the 19th and early 20th century art world. The Brooklyn Museum's collection, from which this exhibition is entirely drawn, offers a great way to tell this story. Although there were a few women begrudgingly admitted to, in the 18th century, the school that was associated with the French Academy, called the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, did not really admit women until the end of the 19th century. And I'm just showing here a typical late 19th century life class in this photograph. And there are many reasons, quote unquote, why the women weren't admitted. That's a whole other story. But other fine art schools established elsewhere in Europe emulated the French Academy's curriculum, ensuring that the style it produced became synonymous with success and prestige, both for artists and for their patrons. And this curriculum was focused on drawing, a skill that was deemed the most important for artists to develop since the Renaissance. Artists learned to draw first by copying after other drawings, as you can see here on the left, then graduating up to copying after sculptures, as you can see in the middle, and finally being able to work after live models, and you see that on the right. So this is an 18th century illustration of a typical art school based on this academic model. So instruction emphasized technical ability, which meant flawless, polished execution, ordered and very legible compositions, and total mastery of the idealized human form. And the Academy also established and enforced a hierarchy of subject matters. And at the very top was what was considered to be morally elevating themes, things drawn from history or mythology or certainly the Bible, in which the human body conveyed meaning and emotion. Jacques-Louis David's 1785 painting that you see here, based on an episode from ancient Roman history, is smoothly executed with an almost hallucinatory clarity. And it features sculptural, idealized figures. And this is a very good example of what the academic curriculum expected, validated, and placed at their hierarchy's absolute pinnacle. And then in order of diminishing significance, the Academy ranked portraiture, landscapes, still life, and finally at the very, very bottom were so-called genre paintings or scenes from everyday life. The Academy also oversaw and juried the annual Salon, which was basically the only public exhibition venue for living artists until the mid-19th century. The Salon, whose jury, or selection committee, was extremely traditional, had taken place in some form since the late 17th century. And in the illustration that I'm showing you here, it's the 1785 Salon, which was held at the Louvre. And amid all the historical paintings hanging, top to bottom in so-called, what is still called today, salon style, you can see the Jacques-Louis David painting that I've indicated, that I just showed you, hung way up in the middle there. So in sum, artists who obviously diverged in some way from any aspect of this academic tradition could basically expect rejection and no viable avenues toward critical or financial success. Around the mid-18th or 19th century, however, these long-standing rules dictating appropriate subject matter and traditional forms of patronage began to erode. This was a time of tremendous social change that, among other things, witnessed the emergence and rise of the art market as we know it, fueled by middle and upper class audiences and collectors who were not necessarily interested in grand paintings of kings and conquests, but preferred images and subjects that were more relevant to their own contemporary lives. And this is humorously illustrated here by Daumier, who was famously rather funny, of this caricature of a gentleman, and the caption says something to the effect that it's very flattering to have his portrait in the exhibition. So it's kind of a very direct way of referencing what people really wanted to see in painting, something that was closer to home. So many artists began to abandon centuries of tradition and these kinds of lofty subjects that had been preferred by the church and state patrons. Intrigued by light effects and their own optical sensations, and inspired by the spaces and figures of contemporary life, these artists instead depicted landscapes, ordinary people, and the low-stakes activities and sights of home, leisure, work, travel. Such subjects appeal to a rising class of bourgeois, urban consumers, although at first there were only a few among this burgeoning audience daring enough to accept the new modes of picture making in which these subjects were often expressed. Because in addition to ignoring the old academic subject hierarchies, many artists also began experimenting with a range of radical new painting techniques, especially the use of bright, unmixed color and gestural brushstrokes that called attention to the very materiality of paint itself, as you can see here in these two very different but equally radical works that are in the exhibition next door. Into the 20th century, artists continued to explore the real world around them, the aesthetic and emotional possibilities of color and form, and new ways of articulating pictorial space, sometimes approaching the edge of abstraction. And art history has helpfully categorized these approaches into a series of isms. And I was delighted when Della showed me a brochure in the gallery that explains all these isms. I said, oh, I'm going to talk about that. These divisions are useful for textbooks and exhibitions, but the movements they describe were overlapping and intersectional, and the artists associated with them were not even necessarily from different generations. In other words, and not surprisingly, the story is far more complex and nuanced than the simple designations and divisions suggest. But they do provide a serviceable way to grasp the sweep and the nature of the transformations that we're going to touch on today. So I want to illustrate them quickly with some works from the exhibition. So realism, capital R, began to flourish in the 1840s. Realist artists typically focused on the direct and truthful observation of the world around them, paying attention to subject matter that had been previously considered to be without artistic value or interest. For example, unmediated nature or the laboring classes. By the 1860s, Courbet was considered realism's leader and champion, and he articulated this position in 1861 when he said, quote, "Painting is essentially a concrete art and can consist only of representation of real and existing things." The idea of so-called anti-narrative, for example, an unpopulated slice of nature that contains no story beyond what can be seen, like this painting of a wave, was one of the most significant strategies Courbet would bequeath to later artists like Monet and Cézanne. Though still somewhat off-putting for those who preferred more consequential motifs, unassuming landscape imagery like this increasingly found favor with urban audiences who sought in these simple scenes of nature a kind of relief from modern and particularly urban exhaustion. Impressionism extended realism's emphasis on observing nature and ordinary life, but the artists most closely associated with the movement had an even more defiant attitude toward these artistic conventions. Finding their motifs in daily life, nature, leisure, work, and urban and suburban spaces, they used bright, unblended colors and broken brushwork to capture the transitory experience of vision and the changing and specific effects of light. And it was through the rise and ultimate commercial success of Impressionism that loose, energetic brushwork, like the kind you see here in this painting, became permanently identified not only with an immediacy of vision, but with the very concept of artistic individuality. Visible gestural brushwork became a kind of indexical trace of the artist's unique presence and response before a motif. And all these qualities, of course, are distilled here in Monet's painting of the windswept cliffs on the beach at Normandy. Post-Impressionism, really an assortment of many different artists and styles, so designated mainly because they came to prominence in the generation after Impressionism, that's literally all post-Impressionism means, expanded and refined the Impressionist interest in optics, light, and color, exploring the nature of representation in ways both analytical and symbolic. Cézanne's geometricized touch and Bonnard's flat color and patterning are just two examples of the many independent styles artists developed in the wake of Impressionism. Symbolism rejected the naturalist claims of Impressionism and its emphasis on visual perception, with artists instead seeking to express spiritual ideas and subjective feelings, often turning to literature and poetry for source material. Here, Redon treats a story from Genesis as if a moment from a dream or an alternative universe in this very vertical format that recalls the kinds of Japanese screens that were extremely popular in France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Fauvism was the first avant-garde movement in the early years of the 20th century. And it was characterized, again, by vivid, arbitrary colors used to very highly decorative, expressive, and emotional effect. And a range of artists worked within this kind of Fauvist vocabulary, including Marc Chagall, who was studying in Paris at the time that this innovative style first appeared. And then, first developed by Picasso and Braque, rather famously, Cubism rejected traditional techniques of perspective and modeling in favor of fracturing objects into facets and planes, suggesting multiple simultaneous vantage points and emphasizing the flatness of the canvas, as you can see here in Villon's portrait. And of course, as the 20th century revealed both the complexity of the human psyche and the horrors of war, surrealism tapped the subconscious mind for biomorphic imagery that is often mysterious and very disquieting, like Yves Tanguy's strange and desolate landscape. So, I want to start the rest of my talk with a painting that is unfortunately not in the exhibition and is by a major artist that also unfortunately wasn't able to be represented here through a work from Brooklyn's collection. But I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with it. It is, of course, Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass, from 1862, now in the collection of the Orsay. Manet's highly unconventional image exploded into the mid-19th century art world. Indeed, in 1863, it was rejected from the Salon, that yearly official government art exhibition that was sanctioned by the École des Beaux-Arts. When Manet's painting was rejected from the Salon, it was instead displayed in a so-called Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused. This was a separate exhibition that the French government staged for artists whose works were not up to the traditional standards. The Salon jury had always refused some works, but this was the first time that the state gave those artists their own alternative exhibition. The 1863 Salon of the Refused became just as popular as the official Salon. It was the subject of many, many caricatures and cartoons. I'm showing you two of them here. And thousands of visitors came to jeer, but also to learn and to be astonished, and in many cases, get a glimpse of the future of art. In these cartoons, the one on the left, the father is telling his son that he should remove his hat in the presence to honor the courage of the unhappy artists who are in the show. And in the caricature on the right, you can see in the lower left, a little bit of a caricature of Manet's painting, which was quite the subject of a lot of conversation. So because of its subject, its composition, its relationship with historical sources, and the very way that it was painted, Manet's Luncheon is a lodestar of a 19th century modern art. And as such, I want to use it as a kind of launching point and a base we can return to as we explore artistic continuities and transformations in this period, roughly from the early 19th century through the early 20th century. So what did people actually see when they looked at Manet's painting in 1863? Let's start with the subject matter. Some kind of indeterminate landscape in which a nude woman sits with two dressed men, with another partially clothed woman in the background. It is essentially a painting of figures in a landscape, and thus it's connected to a very, very long tradition of French art established in the 17th century with artists like Nicolas Poussin. This is very trigger-happy here. Poussin's much imitated formula, carefully composed and idealized vistas, was acceptable to the French Academy because they were the setting for some kind of historical or biblical or mythological figures or narrative that lent the landscape image some kind of moral or intellectual significance beyond just the landscape. This so-called historical landscape, I'm showing you here an example by Poussin, this template remained a part of the DNA of artists well into the 19th century. Manet knew the historical landscape tradition very, very well, having spent hours copying after the old masters in the Louvre. In fact, you can see he loosely based his composition on Titian's Pastoral Concert, which is an iconic Renaissance pastoral landscape. And he directly copied the main figures in his composition after a vignette of river gods that you can see there in the lower right in this famous 16th century print. So he's really a cut and paste artist, very much so. But Manet replaced gods, muses, and Renaissance musicians with contemporary men and women, translating the elevated visual language of the old masters into the rougher jargon of modern life. He emphasized their modernity through the men's bohemian-style clothing and, quite scandalously, by the fashionable dress and hat taken off and casually tossed in a pile near the seated nude woman. So from the sublime nudity of a goddess in an idyllic glade, Manet substituted the plain nakedness of a modern young Parisienne on the banks of the Seine. None of Manet's figures appear to be meaningfully engaging with each other. Each was understandable on its own, but together they made what was for many viewers in 1863 a puzzling composition and a baffling subject. As one critic at the time said of Manet and this painting, quote, "When he places 2 or 3 nude figures on a large canvas next to 2 or 3 others wearing an overcoat, in the middle of a landscape hastily brushed in, I wish he had helped me understand his intention. I'm looking for his and I can't find it. It is a rebus blown out of proportion, which no one will ever unravel," end quote. So we can see both the persistence and the decline of the academic tradition, even in some landscapes by artists less radical than Manet, like Diaz de la Peña in the show. Diaz was a member of the Barbizon school, so named because they gathered to paint in the French village of Barbizon on the edge of the Fontainebleau forest. Forerunners of the Impressionists, Barbizon artists were aligned with realism, sketching from nature directly in the open air. In Bathers by a Woodland Stream, Diaz paints an area of dense, dark woods, true to the realist interest in ordinary, unidealized nature. Yet he adds a group of semi-nude female figures who, with their kind of classical drapery and graceful poses, call to mind goddesses or forest nymphs, thus creating a mythological aura, a little gloss, in what is otherwise a straightforward landscape. Corot was also deeply indebted to the historical landscape tradition, while also still adding the seeds of something slightly new. This beautiful and serene and luminous painting that you can see next door features the kind of feathery brushwork and silvery atmosphere and nuanced light effects that made him an important inspiration for Impressionists of the next generation. Corot's vision here was far too poetic for him to be fully in the realist camp, yet there is a slight departure from tradition here. Instead of a kind of timeless Arcadia dotted with temples or classical figures, Corot is depicting a familiar and specifically observed locality, his parents' country home south of Paris, and the contemporary rural laborers at work there. In another Corot, Young Woman of Sparta, his engagement with an imagined pastoral past is made clear by the dancing women in the background who evoke the 3 graces, as well as the costumed woman with a mandolin who's the focus. Yet Corot's realist sensibility also comes through just a bit in the non-idealized specificity of that woman's face. She was recognizable at the time as one of his favorite and very Parisian-looking models, so not, kind of an ancient Italian or antique nymph, but rather a Parisian girl. Rural labor became a significant theme in European art, particularly in France after the revolutionary upheavals of 1848, when concerns about such effects, about the effects on rural life of industrialization and urbanization really began to intensify. And themes like this were hallmarks of realism. Millet made rural workers his primary focus. Instead of small little details or figures within the landscape, he magnified his figures in both scale and symbolic significance. And the critical and public response to them was divided. In Shepherd Tending His Flock, the figure looms above the horizon. Millet endows the shepherd with an imposing monumentality, his head haloed against the sky as he stands among his flock, almost like a Christ-like figure. Millet did not support such overtly religious interpretations of his work, but his images were widely perceived at the time in both France and the United States as reflecting what was thought to be a kind of inherent spirituality of the rural or peasant working classes. His paintings were extremely popular with American collectors who appreciated what they perceived as their poetry and nostalgia, and they were reassured by visions of what they imagined as an eternal, stable countryside and its unthreatening inhabitants. But more politically conservative viewers and critics did not see an idealized rural past in Millet's paintings, but rather an unadorned and difficult vision of contemporary rural poverty. They saw a shepherd leaning heavily on his staff, his face nearly featureless, yet possibly conveying pain or exhaustion. His blocky work shoes anchor him to the parched grass, and all is painted with a rough touch that might suggest the unrelievedly harsh conditions of rural labor. A few years after the Civil War, one American writer described similar Millet paintings as presenting, quote, the patient, hopeless weariness of the overtasked workman. We saw the unpaid slave of our country, the pauper workman of France and England, end quote. Many conservative critics scorned Millet's work, routinely seeing in them figures dangerously prone to revolution. This fear could be transferred to the artists and patrons as well. One art official in France's imperial government in the 1860s described similar paintings by Millet and other realist artists as, quote, the painting of men who don't change their underwear. So in contrast to Millet, whose peasants might be interpreted as noble or savage, depending on the person's background, Breton's rural laborers, frequently women, were typically perceived as dignified, even majestic. Sentimentalized visions of earthly and female fecundity, like this one, produced again for an urban, upper-middle-class gaze, earned him both critical praise and commercial success. Here he depicts three women bathed in a twilight glow, crossing a flowering field in a way that makes rural existence appear poetic. Their labors, which were, in fact, difficult, dirty, and barely compensated, are portrayed as timeless rituals undertaken with unquestioned acceptance. In a world that was rapidly modernizing, with more people living and working in urban environments, Breton's pastoral visions of unchanging landscapes and contented laborers were soothing and reassuring. No rioting, no striking to be imagined or seen here. While Breton's rural subject matter aligns him with the realist movement, his freer paint handling and attention to light effects reveals Impressionism's increasing influence by the late 1800s. However, Breton remained at heart an academic painter, keeping his focus on the idealized and even classicized human figure. So the two women in the center carry sacks on their bent heads like caryatids, which you see on the right. They were a kind of architectural column figure dating from antiquity. And the third woman, carrying a water and a shovel and a water jug, moves very gracefully, her face gently lit by the setting sun, and her body is curved elegantly like an ancient classical sculpture. These were the kinds of forms Breton had in mind when he was conceiving compositions like this. So although the differences may be subtle or even imperceptible to us, many critics of that time contrasted what they perceived as Breton's gentle vision with Millet's savage one. As one writer described in 1868, quote, "Monsieur Breton never forgets that he is an artist. He achieves results that are more sympathetic and seductive to the public of the city. He is little smitten with reality and generally horrified by the peasantry. Monsieur Millet, on the other hand, has consistently taken the part of brutal reality." The pursuit of modern life subjects distinguished the new generation of painters arriving on the scene in the 1860s. They were responding, in part, to advice the poet and art writer Charles Baudelaire gave in an influential essay he published in 1863, the same year as the Salon of the Refused. Baudelaire urged artists to be, quote, "painters of modern life," declaring that every age has its own expressions and gestures, and that rather than trying to copy or invoke the past, an artist's aim should be to capture what is unique about their own time in order to grant it its rightful place in the sweep of history. In his words, quote, "to distill the eternal from the transitory." These two mid-century illustrations humorously convey the new confrontations between old and new modes. An antique figure like the one from a neoclassical painting by Jacques-Louis David, representing centuries of history painting, faces off with present-day figures, a fashionable Parisienne, probably like Manet's model, and on the other one, a lower-class woman who would appear right at home in a realist painting by Millet. Now, although he's considered an Impressionist artist today and exhibited with the group, Degas rejected that specific label and thought of himself more as a realist. His work also responded to the Baudelairean call to distill the eternal from the transitory by capturing something enduring and essential in his images of modern work and leisure in Paris. This enigmatic painting, for example, an unidentified man in modern bourgeois attire sits in a chair among what look like cuts of meat. A platter bearing a sausage and a pig's trotter rests on the table, and there appears to be a rib roast on the floor, or some people think it looks like a palette, an artist's palette. And midway between these two plates of dead animal flesh are the man's clasped hands, reinforcing this kind of melancholic mood of his face. Anyway, it's been suggested, it's a very mysterious painting, and it's been suggested that the scene may depict a butcher's shop, a restaurant, or perhaps more likely, an artist in his studio. It's a kind of odd combination of portraiture and still life, and there is really no easy explanation of the picture. But what it does, however, is capture a mood and a space that is decidedly modern. This isn't a painting of a king surrounded by courtiers or some other notable historical figure that would have been prized by the academic system, but someone just like you or me in whom we can perceive an unknowable yet recognizable psychological complexity. Manet's Déjeuner painting was originally called The Bath, and like that artist, Degas also modernized the age-old subject of the nude female bather in images like this one that eliminate all the usual trappings of allegory or myth. Degas' painting is thought to be the underdrawing or the initial drawing for an ambitious but ultimately unfinished work. He's really very sensitively established the broad outlines and tonal relationships in monochrome paint, to which he presumably would have added color. And this canvas was still in his studio when he died in 1917. He approached this traditional motif in an unconventional way. Rather than posing his models, he set up wash tubs in his studio and asked them to bathe as they normally would, so he could observe their movements from unexpected vantage points. When Degas famously described such views as being, quote, as if you looked through the keyhole, he meant that the women he portrayed were without artifice. But today, it is difficult not to see such keyhole images as somewhat voyeuristic. But whether such images reflect a kind of objectifying gaze, or in fact resist it with the woman's awkward, decidedly non-sexy poses and kind of inward focus, this has been the subject of quite a bit of scholarly debate. Now, we've talked a bit about how some of the new subjects of modern life, like ordinary sitters and unidealized landscapes, but I want to look more closely now at the other crucial and distinguishing feature of the modern art developing in this time, along with its new subjects, painting styles and methods. What was different about them? So Manet's work is now synonymous with this moment of rupture in painting technique. Some critics and cartoonists, like the one on the right, likened his brushwork to someone using a floor mop to make a painting. They derided his very stark contrasts between light and dark, no kind of subtle, soft modeling, very bold outlines that made his figures look like cutouts, or, as one critic famously put it, like playing cards. Their total lack of that kind of soft, illusionistic modeling of the figure that characterized much of figural art since the Renaissance. And also criticized was his patchy, visible brushwork that was free and gestural, and thus seemed to contain within it an echo of the hand and the brush that put it there. And by painting this way, each brushstroke its own independent event, Manet was calling attention to the process and artifice of picture making, announcing that a painting was nothing more than a flat surface covered with pigment, a realization and an intention that would come to define 20th century modernism. Now, Courbet was another artist whose paint handling was considered an event in and of itself, and we can see this in The Wave. The painting was already radical for its refusal to provide any kind of narrative. There is no story here. It simply depicts a wave as an elemental force of nature. Cézanne admired the very immersive impact of a similar Courbet wave painting, stating that, quote, "It hits you right in the stomach. You have to step back. The entire room feels the spray." Now, rather than using a brush, Courbet applied his paint on this, directly on this canvas using a palette knife, the flexible metal implement traditionally used to mix colors on the artist's palette. And you can see this particularly if you go in the next room and look at the actual picture and not just the slide. You can see this in the white paint of the churning foam and the blustery clouds, which instead of being rendered in a way meant to distinguish those two forms of matter, make them look kind of the same. And critics noticed his unconventional use of a palette knife and thought the artist's waves were too solid, too much like undisguised paint to represent water. In 1870, one critic observed of a painting very similar to this one, quote, "You may look in vain for a drop of water in this petrified ocean. If you took any portion of this picture at random and showed it to anyone who had not seen the whole, he would take it for a piece of wall." So even Cézanne, who admired Courbet, noted that Courbet, quote, "slapped paint on the way a plasterer slaps on stucco." Now, of course, caricaturists, who are among my favorite artists of the 19th century, they lampooned Courbet's method. Instead of a wall, this caricaturist likened the work to cake frosting. And the caption below says, "Allow me to offer you a slice of this lightweight painting." So this kind of discourse, which recognized how Courbet was calling so much attention to his pigments and how he manipulated them, reveals that his subject, so to speak, had largely become the paint itself. And perhaps nowhere was the new radical handling of paint more evident than in works now called Impressionist. When we talk about that movement's origin story, this is the painting that is inevitably discussed, which, by the way, is on view right now at the National Gallery in Washington in their big Impressionism show, if you want to go see that. Monet's Impression Sunrise, a painting of breaking light and reflections in the harbor of Le Havre. He painted it in 1872, and it was one of the works he exhibited 2 years later in the very first Impressionist exhibition. That 1874 exhibition was the first put on by this group of entrepreneurial and stylistically diverse artists that would become known as the Impressionists. They established a dues-paying collective called, rather unimaginatively, the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Printmakers. And between 1874 and 1886, they organized 8 independent exhibitions meant to bypass the salon and its stranglehold. They were able to promote their art directly to the public, while also over the years establishing relationships with like-minded art dealers who helped them create and expand a new market for modern art. When asked to provide a title for this painting, Monet recalled saying, "It couldn't really pass as a view of Le Havre, so I answered, put down impression." A critic was appalled by what he perceived as the painting's lack of finish and really made hay with that comment of Monet's, writing of this painting that, quote, "Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." Many in the press referred to the artists who participated in the Impressionist exhibitions, Monet, Pissarro, Morisot, all of whom you can see next door. They called them lunatics. And the public was encouraged to go to these exhibitions, and the press would say things like, "If you would like to be amused, don't miss it." But others sensed this group's determination not to seek an exact rendition of the external world as something new and exciting. Artists and critics soon embraced the designation Impressionist because, as one sympathetic writer explained, quote, "They rendered not the landscape, but the sensations or impressions evoked by the landscape." This description holds within it much of how this art would go on to be understood and appreciated. Their paintings were not trying to replicate a kind of mirror image or illusion of reality. After all, photography could already do that quite ably. But to allow their own feelings, visions, and sensations, their visual and perceptual experience in front of the motif, to be their guiding force. Working outdoors, or en plein air, as it's said in French, was a bedrock principle of Impressionism. Monet was introduced to this practice in the early 1860s by Eugène Boudin, who was committed to working in this manner, and this painting is so beautiful and right next door. Boudin stated, "Everything that is painted directly and on the spot has always a strength, a power, a vivacity of touch, which one cannot recover in the studio. 3 strokes of a brush in front of nature are worth more than 2 days at work at the easel." Boudin's approach had a profound influence on his younger friend and mentee, Monet, who recalled, quote, "One day Boudin said to me, 'Learn to draw well and appreciate the sea, the light, the blue sky.' I took his advice, and together we went on long outings during which I painted constantly from nature. I have said it before and can only repeat that I owe everything to Boudin, and I attribute my success to him." Monet's Rising Tide Pour Ville exemplifies his iconic Impressionist technique at a point in his career when he was the movement's acknowledged leader. Inspired partly by Courbet's Marines of the 1860s, like The Wave, which we looked at, Monet conveys the choppy, windswept sea off the Normandy coast in forceful, curved brushstrokes. He emphasizes the dramatic setting of this cabin clinging to the edge of the cliff by cropping the right edge of the canvas and adopting an unexpected, elevated vantage point. The roiling sea, the wind-blown vegetation on the cliffside, and the weather-beaten surface of the brick cottage are his ostensible motifs. But Monet's true subject in this and most of his landscapes through the rest of his career were the varied effects of light and air in which he was immersed. As Monet said, quote, "The motif is something secondary for me. What I want to reproduce is what there is between the motif and me." Sisley's Flood at Moret also emphasizes the bright and unblended color and typically sketchy and spontaneous seeming quality of Impressionism. He used a variety of visible and energized brushstrokes across the whole surface of the canvas, from broad, broken ones in the sky to thicker daubs on the buildings and in the middle ground to short, choppy strokes in the water. The individual brushstrokes themselves barely contain or convey form, but the subject comes together across the entire composition. Areas of unpainted canvas visible beneath the blue paint in the upper sky stand for white wisps of cloud, but also signify a picture painted on the spot, quickly, to capture a particular but fleeting impression of a moment in time. Of course, there is a certain degree of myth around this idea of plein air painting, having just said all of that. And all of these paintings were done all in just a matter of minutes. Myth. In the early days of Impressionism, most of its adherents did work on site with speed and directness. But Monet, for example, by the later stages of his career, certainly in the 1890s and after, spent a lot of time in his studio refining his paintings deliberately and methodically from memory. In London in the early 1900s, for example, he painted 19 atmospheric visions of the Houses of Parliament in changing weather and light conditions. He de-emphasizes the architectural details of these iconic buildings, focusing instead on rendering cascading sunlight and shimmering water in loose, overlapping strokes of color. He began all these paintings in front of the motif on a balcony across the Thames, but all of these canvases were completed back in his studio in Giverny. That they look like they were finished in an instant is part of the way they act on us conceptually. It reinforces that the artist's desire was to capture the appearance of a transient moment in the world with freshness, immediacy, and truthfulness. Ultimately, and ironically, Monet worked on these canvases for a long time in order to render what we perceive as an instant. Now, one of my absolute favorite Impressionist works in this exhibition is this portrait by Berthe Morisot, an artist who was at the experimental forefront of the movement. When Morisot was a young woman, her mother encouraged her interest in art and secured private instruction for her, including with Corot, as a matter of fact, whose work we saw earlier, and Corot was the one who introduced her to the practice of painting outdoors. Morisot's mother allowed her to continue studying, even after being told by another teacher that, quote, in their upper social class, because Morisot was from a pretty wealthy family, it would be, quote, revolutionary, almost catastrophic for a young woman to become an artist. But Morisot persisted and went on to become a central figure in the Impressionist circle, participating in all but one of the 8 official group exhibitions, and she only sat out the one the year she gave birth to her daughter. So she came from a well-to-do family, and her paintings reflect an essentially urban bourgeois vision of the world. Because of her gender, she was unable to respectably patronize the evening entertainment venues that Degas and Manet, for example, frequently depicted. She instead focused on the genteel spaces associated with modern upper-class women at home, in the garden or the park, or other areas of polite leisure. And the sitters in this portrait are the artist's cousins, who pose together in a room well appointed with floral upholstery, a piano and sheet music, a mirror, and a vase of flowers. And she underscores the casual intimacy of the scene by placing the little girl on her mother's lap, their hands entwined, and by bringing her subjects very close to the picture plane. And both are quite fashionably dressed, the mother in a black day ensemble and ostrich feather-trimmed hat, and her daughter in a smart blue jacket. Morisot's fluid, unblended brushstrokes foreground, again, the materiality of paint, with all the different objects and textures she depicts treated equally. The chair's floral upholstery, the flowers in the mother's corsage and in her daughter's hair, and the brushy surfaces of the framed mirror and sheet music almost read as abstractions. So many people around the world, all of us in this room, have come to enjoy Impressionist paintings like these and to appreciate the ways they attend to the ephemeral and subjective experience of vision. But it is hard to overstate just how shocking paintings like these were to many people in the 1860s and 70s, and even through the end of the 19th century. Because I love cartoons, these cartoons get at this kind of shock. In one, a pregnant woman is being warned away from one of the Impressionist exhibitions because who knows what could happen. And the other one, it's saying, that Impressionism was a revolution in painting that terrified everyone. So people are literally fleeing from in front of these paintings. So again, what was so disturbing? Well, for centuries, one of the main tenets of academic theory had been the notion that a painting's manufacture, the paint itself, should be, in a sense, invisible and should not call attention to itself. Since the Renaissance, fine art had been theorized as being primarily an intellectual endeavor, emanating from the mind. Thus, the emphasis on artists being able to produce historical or other learned themes, and the de-emphasis on the fact that painting was, in fact, a handcrafted object. Therefore, the subject represented, the narrative, the story, the likeness, should not compete for attention with the physical means by which it was rendered. And this is critical. The academic painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, whose amazing portrait you see here, epitomized the apotheosis of this style in the 19th century. In this and in other of his works, he suppressed the evidence of his own brushwork to an almost uncanny degree. He summed up the academic prescription quite well, noting that, quote, the brushstroke, as accomplished as it may be, should not be visible. Otherwise, it prevents the illusion. It immobilizes everything. Instead of the object represented, it calls attention to the process. Instead of the thought, it betrays the hand. So the writer and champion of Monet and Impressionism, Émile Zola, offered his own tongue-in-cheek description of this academic painting style. Quote, everything will be clean and limpid like a mirror. We will be able to arrange our hair in front of the canvases. So Jean-Léon Gérôme, whose work is on view next door, also excelled at this exacting technique. He was a highly successful traditional academic artist and an important teacher at the École des Beaux-Arts. He started as a history painter, but the changing audiences and marketplace for art meant that he began to use his extraordinary academic skills in the service of more relatable or appealing genre subjects. And one of his major specialties were so-called Orientalist subjects, images of the, quote, exotic peoples and activities of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, like this painting, The Carpet Merchant of Cairo. Gérôme frequently traveled through these regions, but although his detailed rendering lends the painting an almost documentary appearance, and the scene may well be rooted in something he observed there, colorful and generic portrayals like these were designed to appeal to European fantasies of the Arab Islamic world. Not unlike the many paintings of peasants going about their peaceful country ways, imagined scenes like this were interpreted as faithful records of an unchanging region. But to return our attention to the technique, Gérôme seamlessly conjures this itinerant salesperson, his wares, his carpets, and the bustling bazaar in vivid colors and with an impossibly close attention to the nuances of texture, pattern, costume, physiognomy. When you go look in the next room, you will be hard-pressed to detect any evidence of his brushwork. And this is the same is true of paintings by Bouguereau, who, like Gérôme, was among the most accomplished practitioners of the academic manner in the second half of the 19th century. In his early years, Bouguereau produced history paintings like this one. not in the show. But like Gérôme, he too would ultimately spend most of his very successful career and every ounce of his remarkable talent turning out pictures designed for consumers who were decidedly uninterested in history subjects, whether obscure or not. And I think one reading of the title of this painting, Zenobia discovered by shepherds on the banks of the Araxes, gives you some sense of the kind of historical subjects that were, that the Academy was interested in. So with the market in mind, Bouguereau's art dealer, who coincidentally also represented Bert Morisot, encouraged him to focus on untroubling and sentimental subjects that would find favor with a clientele who were more traditional but uninterested in parsing ancient histories. So this painting portrays a rustic young woman gently cradling a small child holding rosary beads. And the title identifies them as siblings, and their surroundings appear rather humble. But their gracefully entwined poses and serene expressions intentionally recall Renaissance paintings of the Madonna and Child that Bouguereau greatly admired while he was studying in Italy. Many people who bought art for their homes in the 19th century preferred paintings such as Bouguereau's to those that displayed more radical approaches to brushwork and form. This was, interestingly, partly because their tastes were shaped by the burgeoning upper-middle-class merchant economy, which valued works that appeared fastidiously and well-made over those that looked slapdash. Now, Bouguereau's saccharine sensibility and smoothly polished execution represented everything that the Impressionists were abandoning in favor of techniques and subjects with more immediacy and freshness. Degas even once very snarkily referred to any overfinished, glossy painting surface as being, quote, Bouguerated, which was his invented word, and it was not a compliment. So the contrast between old and new ways of envisioning the world in paint is evident when you look at Bouguereau's and Morisot's double portraits side by side. It is no wonder that many critics and the public were disdainful and judged Impressionist works like Morisot's to be unfinished at best and incompetent at worst when you understand the standards against which they were being judged. And we've talked a bit about the radical new ways artists like Monet and Morisot were manipulating their paints, revealing and reveling in its materiality and as a visible trace of their own presence in front of the motif. How they were translating a new way of seeing and the fugitive sensations of light and atmosphere and color. But they were also exploring new ways of conceiving space. And in fact, many of their paintings began calling attention to the illusion of perspectival space. In other words, that trick of creating a sense of depth and three-dimensionality in a painting. So rather than continuing to be complicit in the visual illusion that had defined painting since the Renaissance, which is that a painting was meant to be like a window into and through which we look, many artists began to experiment with or deny that illusion completely. And again, we can see this in Manet's Déjeuner. Look at the female figure in the water in the background. Where is she exactly? We want to place her in the background relative to the two other figures, but her size seems off. Front and back or top and bottom, Manet complicates our ability to see depth in favor of bringing our eye back to flatness. Now, if Monet was considered Impressionism's leader, Pissarro was its most dedicated member. He helped organize all the Impressionist exhibitions and was the only artist to participate in every single one of them. He was also the most experimental in his conception of space, as can be seen here, where he dramatically departs from the legible perspectives of traditional landscapes. He uses an array of techniques here, from touches of paint to broad palette knife applications like Courbet used to, and he incorporates multiple vantage points, looking up the path, down through the trees, across at the buildings. The tree trunks seem to be on the same plane as the road and the rooftops behind them, just as the marks representing leaves seem to sit directly on top of the stucco buildings in the background. And the footpath on the right doesn't appear to recede in space so much as it presses up against the picture plane, almost like a vertical aligned with the trees. So this complex treatment of space and form, the solidity and structure of his paint surfaces, and the way he unifies a composition like this through color and tone reveals his interest in capturing his own perceptual experience of the view as it unfolds over time to him. Kaibat, his composition of an apple tree on his garden path, positively flickers with this dynamic oscillation between depth and surface. Blossoms are rendered with thick touches of pink, white, and green. Strokes of red, bright red paint hint at the roof of the estate's various buildings beyond and behind. But in these passages, the roof and the much closer branches seem conjoined and pull our eyes toward the surface of the canvas. Cézanne took a more analytical approach to nature, creating a new formal vocabulary of painted marks that combined the gestural brushwork of Impressionism with geometry. He said he wanted to treat nature through the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, to translate both his individual perceptions and a kind of solid material reality of objects in the world. And here we see how he captured the village of Gardanne in his native Provence through a series of interlocking, overlapping architectonic brushstrokes and expanses of unpainted areas that convey a sense of light. He omitted the surrounding factories that were actually there and coal pits, and instead selected an angle that intensifies the timeless presence of the church and the bell tower. And like Pissarro, with whom he worked side by side in the 1870s, Cézanne treats everything equally on the canvas's surface. The background suddenly connects with the foreground. The boundaries between near and far dissolve. And because it is likely unfinished, we can see the delicate lines he used to start his composition and appreciate how his squares, patches, and lines evoke the things he saw in the world: roofs, leaves, tree trunks, and their complex spatial interrelationships, while also existing as independent marks on the canvas in relation to each other. And perhaps his most significant legacy is this flattening of space, building up an image through a series of juxtaposed planes and lines that seem to cling to the picture's surface, where the background suddenly connects and near and far collapse again. And we can certainly see how Picasso took some of his inspiration for Cubism from Cézanne's vision of intersecting geometric planes. As did other artists like Fernand Léger and Jacques Villon, who variously adapted a Cubist-inspired idiom for images that address the ways that humans actually see, a vision that is not frozen like a still camera, but more like the continuous, ever-shifting vision of the film camera, which was a technology that, not coincidentally, emerged into public consciousness in the early years of the 20th century, just when Cubism was becoming known. Now, I want to wrap up with one more ism, Fauvism, the first European avant-garde movement in the early years of the 20th century. Just as Monet had become the leader of the Impressionist movement, Matisse would become the artist most associated with this style. This painting, for which his wife posed near the French Mediterranean town of Collioure, is an example of Matisse at the peak of the Fauvist movement. And unfortunately, it was not able to be included in this exhibition because it was already promised on loan elsewhere. Fauvism had its roots in Impressionism, but rather than investigating optical naturalism, it was instead characterized by arbitrary colors used for emotional and expressive effect. As Matisse described his practice, quote, "When I apply green, that does not mean grass. When I apply blue, that does not mean sky." The movement famously got its name in 1905 when a critic, unnerved by this aggressive paint handling and riotous colors, used the term fauves, which means wild beasts, to describe similar paintings by Matisse. The artists themselves never really used that term, but André Durand, who was Matisse's partner in this bold experiment, would later liken their colors to sticks of dynamite. Now, Matisse enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, ultimately. He got in, but he only stayed for 2 years, being utterly disillusioned, as you might imagine, by the curriculum and artistic differences with his teachers, who included Bouguereau. Bouguereau was one of Matisse's teachers. Under the sway of Monet and the bright gestural vocabulary of Impressionism, Matisse rejected the traditional academic rules of imitative color and soft modeling and perspective, basically everything that Bouguereau and his work still upheld. And Matisse decided instead to make color his central focus. It's worth noting, however, that although Matisse's techniques were extremely radical, his subject matter, the female nude in and to a certain degree equated with nature, was quite traditional. Just like Manet, Matisse is also referring directly to the 400-year-old pastoral landscape tradition and its imagined worlds of timeless pleasure and harmony. So now to really conclude, one of my favorite paintings in Brooklyn's collection, which is also here next door looking beautiful. It's another iconic Fauvist still life painting by Matisse, a bunch of wildflowers which he evokes by short strokes and beautiful smudges of just unmodulated color. And some of the flowers are floating apart. They become enmeshed in surrounding color field and in areas of absolutely unpainted canvas, which you can see in this detail. So here in 1906, the date of this painting, we see an artist on the edge of abstraction, at the border between pictorial illusion and the kind of pure painting that would soon come to define 20th century modernism. Thank you.